Well, welcome everyone from snowy New York City. We're in the middle, if you weren't aware, of a large snowstorm which is affecting most of the east coast of the United States. So I'm very happy that one of the advantages of the pandemic and doing things remotely is we don't have to worry about the weather or postponing or canceling our program today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Susan Elliott, and I'm the president and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And I'd like to take a thank you, just a minute to thank you for to all of us for joining today's program, which is the launch of our latest report, Reinvesting in US, Japan, Korea Strategic Relations, a Practical Trilateral Agenda. In November of 2020, the National Committee on American Foreign Policy assembled an emerging leaders working group of 10 next generation scholars and experts from the United States, Republic of Korea, and Japan to consider opportunities for and challenges to our trilateral relations. The group met virtually over several sessions with senior level experts and policy practitioners to share their perspectives and policy recommendation for how to chart a path forward for our trilateral coordination. We then drafted a report of the group's recommendation, and it's now available on our website for all of you to read and share. Today, we have asked several members of the working group to join us to discuss policy recommendations from their report and to answer your questions. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the following organizations for their support of this project: the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Henry Luce Foundation, the Korea Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation. So now I'm very pleased to turn the program over to our moderator, Susan Thornton, who's the project director of the NCAFP's Forum on Asia Pacific Security. She'll introduce today's panelists and moderate our discussion. So thanks again to all of you for participating, and I look forward to a great discussion. So over to you, Susan.
Thanks very much, Susan. And I only wish that all of our audience today could have been with us during these really dynamic conversations that we had among a group of, almost 15 different practitioners, young experts, and some of the mentors from previous policymaking positions in the US government. We really had a tough time picking who would be the presenters today. So we've drew straws, and the four lucky winners are here with us today. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Bo-Ram Kwan, who is an Associate Research Fellow at the Center for Security and Strategy at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, but she's currently a visiting scholar at RSIS in Singapore. And we do have people coming to you from all over the globe. So welcome, Bo-Ram. You're probably a little warmer than some of us today. Then we're going to hear from Jessica Lee, who is in the Washington, D.C. environment. She's a senior research fellow on East Asia for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and was a member of a group who just came out with a big report on a new U.S. approach to the Asia Pacific region. She's going to talk to us about sort of domestic political factors in discussing the reinvestment in US, Japan, Korea strategic relations. Bo-Ram Kwan is going to give us an overview of the report. And after Jessica Lee, we will turn to Ayumi Terioka to talk a bit about the regional context for the restart of relations. Ayumi Terioka is a PhD candidate at Princeton University, and she has been working on regional and alliance issues in her professional career, and was previously at the Japan Studies program at the Council on Foreign Relations. And last but not least, we will hear from Saime Kim, who is coming to us from Seoul. She is a PhD candidate at King's College in London, but previously worked at the Pacific Forum as a Korea Foundation Fellow and has done a lot of research on East Asian regionalism. And she's going to talk to us about security cooperation and how we can work on that in a more productive way among the trilateral grouping. So let's go back to Dr. Boram Kwan and hear about the overview of the report, and then we'll turn to each of you sequentially after that. Boram, the floor is yours.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, great.
I zoomed out. Well, hello everyone. My name is Puram. Okay, it zoomed out. My name is Puram, and my role today is to give you an overview of our report. I wanted to talk about how our report was written very briefly, and then introduce the tone of the report, and then go over the overall policy recommendations. There are 4 of these. The writing process, as Susan Elliott as mentioned, was group-based, and we attended virtual series of roundtables on issues of economics and national security, domestic politics and history, and common security challenges. We met with various experts and held very rich Q&A discussions. After the orientation, we were divided into 3 groups, subgroups, each dealing with domestic politics, the regional context, and alliance vision. We wrote our policy recommendations in these subgroups, but then we combined these ideas into one document. I remember during our first meeting in early November, we were asked to talk about what we thought about the trajectory of the trilateral relations. And frankly, because we had seen some backsliding, the mood was not very optimistic. Related to bilateral relations between Seoul and Tokyo, concerns were shared that policy expert groups were discussing the possibility of keeping a cool and business-like relationship at best. But this didn't keep us from brainstorming ideas to find a common denominator. Next, onto the tone of the report. I'd say it is quite deliberate and forward-looking. The report focuses on what we can do rather than dwell on what we could have done. We are fortunate to have the opportunity to conduct a reality check with Mark Napper, so we don't get carried away with the hopefuls. I'd like to note that the report was not shaped in any way to be a consensus document. All of the participants came with different views and with different backgrounds and different skill sets. And trilateral cooperation just has so many dimensions. And I think this means that some points in the report may not completely agree with each other, and it's okay, we've meant it that way. And this just shows how important setting priorities are. That said, let me highlight the 4 overall policy recommendations. I'll be brief, perhaps a little bit abstract. Specific recommendations are categorized into trilateral diplomacy, traditional security issues, and non-traditional security issues and economic issues. Each subgroup representative would have the opportunity to talk about these issues a little later, so I'll make it very brief. Now, the first of the 4 recommendations is that we need to keep expectations low and focus on the early harvesting of low-hanging fruits. Trilateral cooperation should aim for phased convergence rather than a quick or forced cooperation by Washington. This is because threat perceptions differ on China and North Korea, and bilateral ties with the US and between the ROK and Japan need repair. Thus, the US and ROK and Japan should adopt a do no harm approach to the existing security cooperation apparatus, while aiming for a sustainable partnership embedded in a global network based on a mutual respect and understanding. Areas where the US can contribute, there are 3 that we identified. The first is pandemic health and economic recovery, including addressing North Korea's public health needs and concerns. Second is high standard regional economic integration. And third is air defense identification zones and territorial waters monitoring and deconfliction. The second recommendation is that in the short to medium term, we need to pursue cooperation on regional and global issues. I already mentioned that bilateral relations are in bad shape, and absent these strong ties, any effort to pursue trilateralism will fall short. Nevertheless, pandemic recovery, successful preparations for and launch of the Tokyo Olympics are an immediate shared priority. Also, rules-based trade and economic management, anti-piracy and climate change are also of shared concern. The third recommendation is that in the medium to long term, we need to reinvest in and maintain diplomatic engagement on multiple levels. Official working level relations remain relatively robust in the three countries, but broader political and media environments tend to spoil them. As a type of insurance, more education and scientific exchanges tracked to trilateral efforts, parliamentary delegation exchanges could help sustain healthy people-to-people engagement. And also, creating direct and diverse connections between constituencies could also help stabilize public opinion. The fourth recommendation is that we need to incorporate a mixture of high and low profile efforts for sustainable diplomatic engagement. High profile efforts such as official leadership meetings are important signal sending mechanisms. However, much can be done through low profile diplomatic efforts to build habits of cooperation. Think of it as muscle building. The Biden administration can convene high profile meetings, but low profile engagements need to be incorporated to deliver results on the ground that stick. I think that should wrap up my overview. Thank you, and over to you, Jessica.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Hi.
We're going to hear from you now on the sort of the internal dynamics that come into play here and how that affects the recommendations that we made and the way we can go forward. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Dr. Guan. And it's great to reconnect with my colleagues on an all-women panel, which is amazing and rarely happens. So I'm very excited, although you might not be able to tell because I'm still waking up and drinking my coffee. But it's great to be here, Susan. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you, Rory, and your team for bringing us together. I will quickly go over, as you said, the domestic constraints that the three countries face, and the work that my colleagues in the subgroup, Guyan Chung and Junya Nishino and I sort of did over the last 3 to 4 months. Obviously, as we can all kind of appreciate, there are plenty of domestic constraints, unfortunately, that will really challenge, the policies that we recommend. And there are plenty of reasons to be somewhat concerned and pessimistic even, but we do think that as next generational leaders who are looking ahead and have a whole career ahead of us in this field, that we can come up with some really good ideas that will hopefully be practical and most importantly implementable. So as my colleagues and I in the subgroup discussed at length, we talked about COVID-19 and the pandemic quite, every time. That's obviously a top priority for the Biden administration here in Washington, but it's also a top priority in Tokyo and Seoul. On foreign policy, President Biden has pledged, as we know, to renew alliances around the world, particularly in East Asia and Europe, as part of his strategy to, tackle these global challenges. So, in terms of the constraints, for the United States, my colleagues and I talked about this growing tendency that I see here in Washington of, hawks who, are sort of exaggerating China's threat and, thereby reducing the room to tackle urgent challenges such as climate change and pandemics. I see this as a growing issue and something that, will be front and center for President Biden. I mean, essentially, he has to try to resist calls to frame the US-Japan ROK strategic cooperation within the framework of a grand China containment strategy, and instead pursue a strategy that's based on cooperation, humility, and pragmatism. In Japan, the biggest domestic constraint that we've identified in terms of forging more productive trilateral relations is the low public opinion towards South Korea. There seems to be a consensus, within the policymaking space and, expert community that trilateral cooperation would indeed be good on a number of fronts and have strategic value. But, disagreement over historical issues have generated negative feelings towards South Korea. And it's actually reached a 41-year low. And so, this was, of course, exacerbated by the recent ruling by the Seoul Central District Court about the comfort women issue as well. And so we see that, coupled with the fact that there's a general election and an LDP re-election this year, to assess that it's going to be very difficult for there to be, major public breakthrough between Tokyo and Seoul. And it could limit the Suga administration's interest in doing anything high profile or groundbreaking with respect to trilateral cooperation. Similarly, the biggest barrier toward improving trilateral cooperation on the part of South Korea is in building trust and positive relations with Japan, which colonized South Korea from 1910 to 1945. There's bipartisan, hostility and concern about Japan and its perceived growing militarism, as well as its reluctance to address historical issues, including forced labor. And so, and of course, with Japan's export restriction against South Korea in 2019, there's quite an economic price as well that's associated with this worsening relations. And it seems that, according to my South Korean counterpart in the subgroup, that South Korea is viewing the trilateral relationship primarily through the lens of a kind of multilateral international order, rather than in sort of an America first like nationalist terms or in great power competition like framework, and that they have their own ideas of how to work constructively with countries like Japan and United States to hopefully address the issue of North Korea and its nuclear armament. So where do we go from here, given all of the uncertainties I laid out? One low-hanging fruit that we identified is to go back to the 2017 Trilateral Vice Foreign Ministers ministerial meeting that then Deputy Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan, Shinsuke Sugiyama, and First Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of South Korea, Im Sung-nam, agreed on, such as closer cooperation on women's empowerment, space policy, and humanitarian assistance. We also see room for greater cooperation and synergy between the business communities, environmental groups, and others who might have shared priorities that just have never really been front and center in the minds of strategists. And so I guess I'll just end by saying, as we were working through the subgroup and these discussions, one thing that struck me was that at least the diplomats of of Japan and South Korea seem to be saying somewhat the right thing. I'm talking, of course, about South Korea's new ambassador to Japan, Kang Cha-il, and then Japan's new ambassador to South Korea, Koichi Aobashi. And both have said positive things about what their focus on improving relations. And of course, Ambassador Aobashi previously served in Seoul when current President Moon Jae-in was the chief of staff to former President Roh Moo-hyun. So there seems to be, at least on paper, some ways that diplomats can help build the connective tissues, as Dr. Kwon said, and help supporters of the Trilateral Alliance find a way forward. And of course, I think that is really the point of this working group, to bring people together to start laying the groundwork so that various administrations in the three countries, if they want privately for trilateral relations to improve, they certainly have people like us who are able and willing to help. And I think finally the track 2 setting for this project was really critical in building the kinds of openness and trust that I think we need from all three countries, so that we're not sort of reading talking points and entrenched in our little corner in terms of our mindset, but really equalizing the playing field and really hearing from all sides as to what has previously been difficult and how we move ahead as we look to the next 10 to 20 years. So I'll stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica, for that. And I certainly echo the spirit of the project, which was sort of meant to try to build these bridges among the sort of next generation experts and scholars, and with a forward-looking kind of viewpoint. So with that, let's go to Ayumi Teraoka, who's going to talk to us about the regional context for this trilateral investment in this, in our relations, and how that impinges on what we're trying to do. Ayumi, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and I deeply thank NCAFP's great leadership and team for putting together this important event in such an opportune time. Boram, Kwan, Andrew Park, and I drafted the section of a regional context, and our general strategy here was really to help create incentives for these three countries to accelerate their cooperation on regional shared interests while putting aside issues on which their positions diverge. We hope that working on these select issues will give the time and space for the ROK and Japan, the weakest link of the triangle, to build mutual trust in the meantime, and also reassure us, the observers, that it is perfectly healthy and okay to have three vibrant democracies to have policy disagreements on some issues, as long as they do not spill over into other areas of important cooperation. In this respect, we focus our policy proposals on four key issue areas: measures against Chinese economic coercion, policies toward economic integration of the Indo-Pacific, security cooperation on regional contingency planning, and regional cooperation on pandemic recovery. First, I will turn to economic coercion piece. Tokyo and Seoul have both been targeted by China's economic coercion in the past, along with many key US allies in Asia and Europe. Despite Seoul's ambivalence in picking a side and this so-called US-China rivalry, this is really the area the South Korean public remembers vividly and bitterly as China turned against South Korea for its decision to deploy THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Missile System, by sanctioning South Korean entertainment industry and ROK retail conglomerate Lotte Groups in China. Seoul has interest in joining other like-minded states to protest and come up with measures against such future use of weaponized economic interdependence by China. Japan, after facing China's economic coercion in 2010 regarding rare earth minerals, has been working with partner states like United States and Australia to find alternative sources of rare earth minerals. Recently, India, Japan, and Australia began joint dialogue on the topic of securing supply chains as well. Now that many more countries have suffered this use of economic coercion by China, rather than leaving these private companies and business associations to suffer the cost of economic retaliation by China and do nothing about it, here we propose that we set up an informal platform of countries led by officials and business leaders who share concerns over China's use of economic coercion and discuss joint measures. In the medium to long term, we need to come up with ways to bolster norm setting about use of economic coercions or sanctions in general, and more effective dispute resolution mechanisms. Existing international institutions such as WTO should be revived and reformed, but given its current stagnation of WTO and its pretty slow process for adjudicating disputes, we should aim for setting up informal grouping in the immediate term to send a strong signal to Beijing that it is not okay for it to be continuing what it has been doing recently. Second, given that Indo-Pacific region continues to drive the world economy and growth, we should continue to use economic integration as a key geostrategic tools. The last year's signing of the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, only highlights the regional interest and demand for such frameworks, and the importance of leadership in those fora. But we all know that the standard achieved by RCEP is far from the one achieved by CPTPP, Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, pretty mouthful, in terms of protection of labor rights, protection of intellectual property rights, as well as trade liberalization standards. So the CPTPP should be the guiding mechanism, not only for the future economic integration, but also the general rulemaking of trade and investment for the Indo-Pacific. But here we think the sequencing of the entry into CPTPP is pretty important. Today, February 1st, Britain is formally applying to enter into the CPTPP. And this is a much welcome trend as it sets up a precedent for countries other than the original signatory members to join this initiative. President Moon Jae-in's publicly expressed interest last December in joining CPTPP should be welcome, and ROK's entry should be collectively not just by Japan, but collectively endorsed by other member states. It will be beneficial for the ROK to join the CPTPP before the United States re-enters, or even China that has also expressed interest in joining, does so that Seoul can minimize some geostrategic concerns about choosing a side in this US-China competitions. And of course, the Biden administration should work with congressional Democrats and members of Congress to really move forward with the rejoining the CPTPP. When Obama administration was pushing forward with the original TPP, President Obama often said in interviews, if we don't write the rules, China will write them for the region. And this sentiment should resonate more with members of Congress who are forming bipartisan consensus on the importance of competing with China. Yet at the same time, we see little enthusiasm in the US Congress to integrate trade in the broader US regional strategy. So Biden administration really must bridge this gap. Finally, we should not forget the leadership of free liberal democracies like South Korea, Japan, and the United States in the regional economic integration process is critical in leaving the possibility of Taiwan's entry in such fora, which would have helped expand Taiwan's international space and also help it fight against economic pressures and diplomatic isolation orchestrated by the PRC recently. Third, we should capitalize on some opportunities to expand these three countries' general security cooperation in the region. For instance, team has raised this trend of Chinese and Russian intrusions to Japan and ROK's overlapping ADIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone, present opportunities for Japan and ROK to shelve their sovereignty disputes over Dokdo and Takeshima and come together to protest against suspicious coordination that might be going on between the Chinese and Russians. Moreover, Japan and ROK should work to deepen the public understanding of the intelligence sharing agreement's value, the General Security of Military Information Agreement, GSOMIA, and also promote the bilateral signing of the Acquisition and Cross-Servicing Agreement, AXA, which is the agreement over logistics. But how do we do that? One proposal we suggest is to continue to use tabletop exercises on various contingency scenarios, but also capitalize on this expanding use of virtual settings, such as video conferencing system, to engage with a larger pool of experts and a broader public in various war games. We hope that this broader public engagement on regional contingency scenarios will help raise public awareness exactly why Seoul and Tokyo need GSOMIA, exactly why they need AXA, and why enacting these agreements does not automatically mean Japanese self-defense forces boots on the Korean peninsula. We should also try to involve Korean strategists, including some retired ROK generals, in some contentious regional contingency discussions, including the one in Taiwan Strait or in the East China Sea scenarios. Last but not least, these countries also face tremendous difficulties of overcoming pandemic. Seoul and Tokyo are currently facing challenges as we speak, but in relative terms, they have managed COVID with much fewer casualties thus far. We think it is important to bring Seoul, Tokyo, Taipei, Singapore to lead regional initiatives on COVID recovery by sharing best practices and potentially working to distribute vaccines to other developing countries in the region, including North Korea, and perhaps have it as a starting point to engage with Pyongyang. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to discussing these proposals with you. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Ayumi. Fantastic presentation and a long list of to-dos there. For our last presenter, we're going to turn now to Sae-Mei Kim, who is going to talk to us about the strengthening of the alliance cooperation and security cooperation among the three parties. Sae-Mei, over to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you, Dr. Kwan. I'm really happy to be here and share the months of exciting work that we've done on recommendations for trilateral security cooperation, as well as how our discussion fed into some of the policy recommendations. Our initial discussion focused on coming to an assessment of the reality of present-day trilateral relations, We agreed, as the other speakers mentioned, that divergences in threat perception concerning North Korea and China present some challenges in forming a common alliance vision, which would be needed to facilitate closer security cooperation. For North Korea, the assumption used to be, particularly in the 2015 to 2016 period, that North Korea's missile testing or other provocations, that this would push trilateral relations together, for example, enabling intelligence cooperation. But in the present circumstances, it's not clear whether this would still be the case. Rather, if North Korea does return to provocation, the responses by Seoul and Tokyo could potentially highlight just how divergent the threat perception is. For China, there's a similar divergence of threat perception. Seoul and Tokyo have robust economic relations to Beijing, but at the same time, they're vulnerable to economic coercion, as we saw in the aftermath of the THAAD deployment, of South Korea's THAAD deployment. On the US side, I think we are getting the sense that although the Biden administration will carry on some themes of the Trump administration's China policy, it will also identify areas where the US and China are able to cooperate and form a cooperative agenda on issues such as climate change. Just a few days ago, the Biden administration's climate envoy, John Kerry, stated that the US will find ways to work with China, so there might be some positive developments there. So these divergences in threat perception, along with the domestic constraints and regional challenges mentioned by the previous speakers, it led us to arrive at an overarching principle, one that we think was a realistic and pragmatic guide to thinking about the recommendations for security cooperation. And that's the idea of do no harm, as Dr. Paul mentioned. And really, this is the idea that none of the three countries should take action that could erode the institutions that we currently have in place, both bilaterally and trilaterally. We recognize that it is a conservative starting point, but also it's important to note that before we can think about how to make big jumps in trilateral relations, we have to make sure not to take action that could lead to regression, as was the case with the Jisomia incident and the radar lock incident. So with this framing in mind, we came to some recommendations based on the short, medium, and long-term timeframes. In the short term, perhaps in the first year of the Biden administration, our recommendations were that the priority should be on sending out the right signals. This includes filling key positions, arranging cabinet-level visits to Seoul and Tokyo, and really focusing on strengthening channels of communication bilaterally between the US and the respective allies. We agreed that this will send a strong signal that the Biden administration is committed to alliance relations in Asia. And already, as we're seeing positive signs with the designation of Secretary Blinken, we can expect to see greater emphasis on alliance relationships and the promotion of a rules-based order. Our subgroup also agreed that repairing bilateral relations will need to come before trilateral relations, building trilateral relations. So, for example, issues such as cost-sharing negotiations with South Korea, this will need to be resolved in the short term. Also, efforts that show that the Biden administration is really listening to the concerns that Seoul and Tokyo have with regards to, for example, China's economic coercion, as Ayumi mentioned, or concerns between Seoul and Tokyo. This will go a long way in restoring trust in Washington. We noted that a lot of this will have to occur behind the scenes. So this would be one of the low-profile engagement efforts mentioned in the overall recommendation section of the report. In the medium term, the focus should be on building an alliance vision that coheres with regional threat perception. And here's where we would try to improve trilateral cooperation, but through a gradual and phased approach, rather than a quick or forceful convergence. We all agreed that if the Biden administration publicly calls for trilateral convergence too soon or too early on, this will likely be counterproductive given the current state of Seoul-Tokyo relations. So we thought of different levels to promote this. For example, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, we could carry out virtual meetings on matters that offer the broadest areas of cooperation, such as global public health, the demographic challenges that Seoul and Tokyo face, climate change, cooperation on carbon neutral pledges that Seoul and Tokyo made. And then there are new domains that haven't been traditionally dealt with trilaterally, such as cybersecurity, space, and Arctic exploration. So the aim would be here to build habits of cooperation that could spill over into other domains. And then there are areas where discussions are needed to narrow the threat perception gap. For example, on North Korea, this includes sharing views on how to maintain leverage, provide the right incentives, sequencing the incentives, and so on. Gradually, and as a high-profile diplomatic engagement effort, we recommended that trilateral dialogue at the higher levels is institutionalized through a 2+2+2 framework, which would bring together the foreign and defense ministries in Korea and Japan, and the defense and state secretaries in the US. This could happen on the sidelines of a regional forum where the participants are already gathered together. This can begin bilaterally between the US and Korea and the US and Japan, and then maybe in the following year, hold an actual trilateral 2+2+2 meeting with a trilateral agenda. So this would send out a really strong message that there's a coherent alliance vision among the three states. In the long term, we thought about the tasks that could be achieved based on the strengthened trilateral relations. And this is where we really need to be creative and demonstrate strong political will. One area was trilateral planning in terms of a Korean Peninsula contingency. Our subgroup noted that the role of the US-Japan alliance in case of a contingency, this needs to be updated to reflect Japan's vulnerability concerning the realignment of US forces in the region, as well as OPCON transfer in Korea. Trilaterally, efforts can be made to establish standard operating procedures to avoid accidental collision in this region, as well as dealing with airspace incursion by Chinese or Russian aircraft. Our group also discussed ways to enhance military-to-military relations. For example, we can consider joint training between Japan's maritime self-defense forces and the ROK Navy under the guise of improving anti-piracy capabilities in the Gulf of Eden and the Indian Ocean. We can also seek to expand trilateral cooperation with other like-minded partners, such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and institutions like NATO. Our subgroup noted that the likelihood for trilateral cooperation is probably higher if it addresses the issues that are not physically linked to the geopolitics of Northeast Asia, which is why we mentioned cooperation in regions such as the Horn of Africa, the Arctic, and in Southeast Asia. So ultimately, these efforts will demonstrate that trilateral relations will be a force multiplier in supporting a rules-based order. So that's it from our subgroup. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions and comments.
Great, thank you, Sammy. That was a really comprehensive overview and pretty clear that there's a lot of good areas for further work, but that some of them could be sensitive and might not be that easy to start off on. Let's go now to an introduction of our other working group participants who are joining us for the Q&A part of the session that will start shortly. I'd like to introduce 4 of them. We have first Professor Kuyun Chung, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at Kangwon National University in the ROK. We have Professor Sarah Berg-Moeller, who is an assistant professor in the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University here in the US. We have Mr. Masashi Murano, who is the Japan Chair Fellow at the Hudson Institute. And we have Andrew Park, who is a consultant at the Center for CSIS here in the United States in Washington, DC, and works on Asia regional issues. So we do have 2 other working group participants who are not able to be with us today, and I just want to mention their names briefly. One is Junya Nishino, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Keio University in Tokyo. And we have also Ankit Panda, who is the Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, DC. They will not be with us, but we do have now a full group of 8 working group participants to answer your questions. And if I can start off with a question that came in from Jim Zumwalt. Jim asks, can we further explain the recommendation that the 3 countries engage on future-oriented women's empowerment issues? And can the United Nations Women, Peace, and Security Initiative be a forum to advance this important work. So I'd like to turn maybe to Jessica and then to Kyuyun, if you could just be quick because we have a bunch of questions, but give us your thoughts on that question. Thanks. Jessica,
Thanks,
first you.
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Ambassador, for your question. I think, Junya, Kyuyun and I were thinking along the lines of, what has transpired in recent years on the issue of women and women's role in ending conflicts and building peace abroad. We saw in 2017, President Trump signing the Women, Peace and Security Act, which had bipartisan support that really sought to elevate this issue, across the board in US government. And so, when we think about women's issue, we of course turn immediately, in this context, we of course turn immediately to historical issues, but there are other women's issues that women today are confronting with, whether it's the glass ceiling or sexual violence and conflict abroad, right? Elevating the role of women in conflict prevention more broadly, as I just said. And also perhaps most importantly, elevating women into policy roles within our governments. There are not many women who are making foreign policy in our 3 countries. And so what can strong, mature democracies do to address that deficiency? And so I think there are many ways to think about it, including in the UN context, as you mentioned, Ambassador. But I guess finally, there are already institutions like Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat, that my intern actually, Ryosuke Sawayama, is now there as a staffer in Seoul. But there are institutions that are, quasi-government, non-government, et cetera, that I think would be willing to work on this area in a trilateral fashion. So I think this is an area that merits greater examination. But I'll turn to Kyuyun for additional insights.
Yes, Kyuyun, great. Thanks very much, Jessica. And Kyuyun, we had one of our strong women foreign policy leaders recently be sort of announced that she was going to be leaving her post in Korea. And I wonder what thoughts you have maybe on a future role for Foreign Minister Kang, but also how you see this issue in more general terms.
Well, first of all, when it comes to the suggestion that our group posted on this report is that not only Jessica mentions about this women's voice and women's kind of status should be elevated in and out of the governments, but at the same time, we thought about much bigger kind of pictures, like as Ambassador Zumwalt mentions, the Women and Peace thesis has been kind of resonating in South Korea. Actually, we are kind of holding this conference second times last year, and we are continue to sustain that effort this year as well. We are trying to kind of come up with how women can contribute peace, and these 2 factors can kind of synergize in each other's, and not only within the Northeast Asia, but also kind of globally, like Africa or kind of war-torn kind of region. So I think this conference, representative of United States and Japan, as well as United Nations, are already participating. So I think we can kind of emphasizing this venue in which we 3 countries can kind of cooperate and expand the area of cooperations. And when it comes to Secretary Kang, well, I think she has served a long time, and she has served she has kind of addressed many difficult issues, and in a very difficult time. So I think she has done her best, and I think it's time to take turns to other experts.
Great, thank you. Another question comes in from Stafford Ward. What are the panelists' thoughts on the ROK candidates in the upcoming 2022 ROK presidential elections, on future ROK-Japan relations, such as Jisomia, and will the ROK continue on its path towards, quote, armed neutrality, unquote? And maybe I can go first to Andrew Park for your sort of just off the cuff thinking about the run up to the next ROK election, how it might affect, ROK-Japan relations, but more broadly, what kinds of changes do we see coming, if any?
Can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Great. Thank you, Stafford. It's always good to engage with the former member of the Sejong Society, especially if it is a case who is the founder of the Sejong Society, right? So yeah, presidential election in Korea. So if you look at the race or the popularity poll, currently it is the governor of Gyeonggi province, Lee Jae-myung, who is leading the game with 32%. And then it's Yoon Sung-yeol, the prosecutor general, who is perceived to be the conservative, despite being just a civil servant without any partisanship. And then there is the former prime minister of the Moon government, Lee Na-kyun, who is known to be, who is expected to be pro-Japan for his past, being a special correspondent in Tokyo, being a journalist in Tokyo, and even singing enka when he's drunk. That said, let's look at the first horse, right? Governor Lee Jae-myung, he's known to be very hawkish on many issues, including Japan. When Park Geun-hye administration, it was when it was reported in 2016 that Park Geun-hye government signed Ji So-mya, he accused former President Park as a traitor who cannot fool her blood, being a traitor family, right? And then he further was in a hot debate with a Japanese journalist during the press conference, accusing Japan as a country of an invader that illegally occupied the Korean Peninsula in the past. That said, he tried to assure Japanese journalists about a month ago during his interview with the Japan Shimbun that he's not against Japan. He said it very diplomatically, as if he's running for the presidential election already, that he wants to see the two countries to have a joint effort in improving the relations. So in gist, there is a long way to say we don't know. We don't know. He's very hot-headed, but at the same time, presidents both in the United States, in different countries, presidents and presidential candidates tend to be very globalist, because they have to then deal with global issues, including the foreign policy, even if it is the case that the candidates are more focused on domestic issues, and which force them to address the domestic grievances. Especially it is the case in Korea, because Japan is very deeply embedded into the public sentiments and psychologically because of the history. So Ji So-mya, I think we all agree that it is the best if you are an advocate of the alliance, right? It is the best to just leave it quietly and keep it in a low key. Even the Moon administration, after having this hotly debated controversy over not renewing it or just using it as a tool against Japan during the mini trade war a few years ago, the Moon government ultimately didn't withdraw from the agreement. We all saw that, and nobody's talking about it because it is the best way to keep it quiet and leave it alone. Maybe despite the fact that Lee Jae-myung attacked furiously against Ji So-mya decision back in 2016, he will do the same. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to try to lump a couple of questions together here and direct them to multiple panelists, because they really kind of get to the heart of a lot of the conversations that we had in the working group. So the first grouping has to do with sort of how can the U.S. effectively wield its influence in this trilateral formation to help ameliorate some of the frictions in the Japan-Korea relationship. Chu-Ping-Hu asks, is South Korea going to have to align itself closer to the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy? Of course, it's still early days in the Biden administration. We don't know exactly what their Indo-Pacific strategy is going to look like. But she says it seems that the convergence of interest between Japan and Korea often gets overwhelmed by these frictions that we've been talking about. And Jim Gannon says, you know, is it useful for the US to be putting pressure on Seoul and Tokyo to push the two of them to a resolution on history issues? Or is it counterproductive for the US government to be trying to do this? So knowing that the group talked a lot about this, maybe I can turn to you, Ayumi, and maybe to Masashi for your thoughts on this question. How useful is the US in doing this?
Thank you so much. Hi, Jim. It's so good to see you. So thank you for your questions. I think there's a lot of room for US to play, especially in promoting multilateral platform for Japan and South Korea to join together so that, you know, other like-minded countries like Australia, Singapore, like all these countries that share particular interest in a particular issue can come together. And, you know, along that sidelines of those meetings, perhaps ROK and Japan have more opportunities to talk about those bilateral difficult issues. But for US to really come back to multilateral fora actually provides much more opportunities for ROK and Japan to be sitting side by side on same issues and realize that they have much more common than what they actually diverge on. So I think that's one thing. On the question of history issues, I would say there's really little appetite for, at least from the Japanese perspective, for US to be intervening on the question of history. I think the experience of Comfort Woman deal in 2015 and, you know, and what happened to President Park afterwards really kind of delegitimized the agreement, and the role of very active US diplomacy there also was attached to that package of, you know, of kind of failed agreement. So for now, I would say that on the history issues, US should be only quietly working behind the scenes to encourage these two countries to talk to each other, but not really pushing forward with the resolutions. Rather, I think US has a lot more opportunities for these two countries to come together by providing other different fora and make them realize that they have more interests in common. Thank you.
Great. And Masashi, do you have any thoughts on this? And maybe then we can go to Boram for a perspective. Somebody's also asking about how younger Korean and Japanese people see the 1965 Treaty on Basic Relations. This is a question from Tom Kono. So it sort of fits in with this general line of questioning. Do they think that it's an unfair treaty that needs to be amended? And in the current dispute about its interpretation, is this something that could be resolved through dialogue? So just to give that additional perspective from the questioners on this issue, which I think is kind of fundamental to a lot of the discussions we had. But let's have Masashi and then to Boram. Go ahead, Masashi.
Thank you very much. But basically, that I agree with that Teraoka-san's point of view, especially that yes, this is actually the bilateral issue between the Japan and ROK. So yeah, sometimes the U.S. government try to work on these issues to relax on the political pressure between both countries, but it is not necessarily to work well. So in that reason, one of the best option is the quietly and watch and wait and see to wait what's the both country doing. So that is this is one best way, I see.
Great. No, thank you. That's helpful to get that perspective. But Boram, do you have any thoughts from the Korean perspective?
Just to comment on Mr. Tom Kono's question about what younger generations think about the 1965 basic resolution. I think I haven't seen recent polls about that specific issue, but I would think with the pandemic, the priorities of the younger generation would be what's my job going to be. I think people have been fatigued about this historical issue for the past couple of years, and that's sort of shown in the EAI survey. But the good thing is that younger generations are more open to change. They want change, and they're okay with making steps forward. So although I can't answer directly the question, I think there is room for moving forward if leaders, if not leaders, experts can sort of convey the correct message to them.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you. Let's, if we can, go live to a questioner, and we had Jeffrey Hornung was raising his hand, and if I can ask my staff to unmute you, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. This is a wonderful conversation. I'm enjoying all of this. I see some friends there as well. My question is this: I heard a number of speakers referring occasionally to planning, concepts of planning, and in the Japanese context, we hear sometimes right now when they're talking about their deterrence capabilities, we hear a hypothetical argument that Japan should be able to strike missiles on North Korean launch pads should they be preparing to strike Japan. Now, obviously, if Japan acquired those capabilities, we know they don't have them, but if they acquired those capabilities and actually did that, that would cause enormous challenges to existing US-Korea concept of operations, planning. It would cause an enormous challenges for Japan to do that unilaterally. And so the question I have is there an opportunity here, understanding that trilateral concept of operation development, trilateral planning, this would benefit Korean security, it would benefit Japanese security. You know, I guess the question I have is, what are the challenges to actually having a serious conversation about that? Not Japan's troops, you know, boots on the ground, but rear area support. What are the challenges to actually having that that conversation, and where do you think we're most likely to see some progress in that conversation? Thank you.
Great, very good question. There was a lot of discussion about this kind of thing among the participants. So maybe Sarah, I saw you nodding your head, if maybe we could get you in on this conversation and go first to you for any thoughts that you want to chime in with, and then maybe to Masashi.
Great. Thank you. Obviously, of course, Masashi will have a lot to say on this, and we're missing Ankit Panda, who is the real expert, but I'll give it a shot. I think, obviously, Tokyo is going to be more receptive to this than Seoul is, and I see it right now probably as a bridge too far for a lot of the themes that we've been mentioning. So I suspect that there will be a lot of reticence on the part of the South Koreans for even initiating this conversation, but I leave it to the country experts to add as well, whether I'm correct in that hunch.
Okay, well, let's try Masashi and then maybe Seimei just very quickly, and then we can go to the questions about China. Masashi?
So, well, thank you very much, Jeffrey. So you may know that my opinion about this issue is that in the first place, I think about when we addressed on these issues, we needed to redesign of the command and control structure of the Korean Peninsula itself, because of the US ROK based on the US ROK combined command based on the plan and has a responsibility to they operate on the in this field, so-called KDO, Korean Theater Operation, some contingencies based on the concept of operations. But now that the kind of the command and structure has been based on the legacy of the Korean War in 1950s. So, but now that assumption is Japan still remains geographically and strategically safe logistical support area, avoiding to the some strategic strike from the Korean Peninsula. But now that North Korea has a lot of missiles and the nuclear capability to striking and threatening Japan, to decouple our logistical cooperation and our alliance support. So in that reason, that Japan needed to has expanded their role and the responsibility, mean that to involve that the command policy planning and operational planning process with US ROK Command or United Nations Command. So that is the first step to involve if Japan doesn't have some own long-range strike capability, but also even Japan focus on the logistical support, that the fundamental elements drastically changed. So we needed to redesign of the command and control structure itself.
Okay, Seimi, do you want to chime in on this?
Sure. I would have to agree with Sarah that I think this is a bridge too far, at least for the time being. I think it will be a while before any productive discussion on this can happen in South Korea. And this discussion will need to involve Korea's plans and desires for the upcon transfer. For Korea, there's another set of challenges associated with this, and that's inter-Korean relations. At the recent North Korean Workers' Party Congress, Kim Jong-un stated that he's willing to resume inter-Korean dialogue on the condition that our US ROK military exercises are suspended. But these exercises are an integral component to verify that Korea is ready for upcon transfer. And there's also the time constraint that the Moon administration wants to achieve this by 2020 before his term finishes. Moon even stated that the topic of US military exercises can be discussed with North Korea through the Inter-Korean Military Joint Committee, which demonstrates that he's willing to further downscale the exercises or include just the essential functions of the operational capability verification test. So I think in the long term, maybe this is a discussion that could be had, but for the moment, it's as Sarah mentioned, this is a bridge too far.
Okay, no, thanks very much, all three of you. Let's turn now to a bunch of questions that we have that all touch on the issue of China. And well, they're very broad, but let's start with the question from Duncan Bartlett that basically is asking, how would the conversation among this trilateral grouping have differed if it was a trilateral grouping sponsored by Beijing and held between China, Japan, and the ROK? Then we have an anonymous questioner who mentions that both the ROK and Japan face a China challenge, but how can they overcome the ROK-Japan mistrust in order to sort of enable stronger security cooperation with the, I guess, view toward this China challenge? And then we had another anonymous attendee ask a question about the impact on Japan, Southeast Asia, US, et cetera, and the security posture of China's new Coast Guard law, which in the media has been noted for a provision that gives permission for Chinese Coast Guard ships to fire on fishing ships and other ships in the disputed areas of the South China Sea. So we can bundle those few questions together, and together with another question from Hollis Hart, which is about whether or not there was a wide divergence of opinion among our panelists about whether China's economic activities, and Ayumi was talking about the sort of effort to counter China's coercive economic policies, weaponized interdependence, et cetera, whether there was a wide divergence of opinion about the need to respond in a joint way to these kinds of actions by China, and whether or not there was a requirement for policies that need to push back on this. So that's 4 different questioners all getting at sort of the same elephant in the room, which is China, and how did we talk about it and think about it. So I'm not sure who wants to tackle this, but I'm going to try to call on a few different people. I mean, maybe Sarah, you can start us off, and If others have thoughts, you can wave at me on the screen, or we'll
Sounds
spend a
good.
couple minutes on this before going to the next question. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you, Susan. Sounds good. Well, let me start by noting, Duncan, that counterfactuals are always tricky. But I think one thing we can say for sure is that if this had been an initiative hosted in Beijing or organized by China, we wouldn't have seen the intellectual freedom and leeway. And this goes to Hollis's question as well. There was, and as participants on this call know, given the National Committee's stellar reputation in the field, we were given complete leeway, total intellectual freedom to, as a group, articulate ourselves and come up with this report. And so if this had been a China-run project, I think, and this is my take, I think it would be fair to say that we would see more emphasis on integrating the actors in a web of dependence on Beijing, whereas what we're seeing, and this was to answer Hollis's question, by far the consensus, indeed, I don't think there was any disagreement on this point, that there needs to be not just a trilateral, but we would go even further, I think, would say a multilateral response to growing Chinese economic coercion. We see it whether it's South Korea after the THAAD installation, or now it's Australia with the beef and wine imports. We've seen it with Norway in the past, and certainly with yesterday's news out of London that Boris Johnson's government is looking to join the CPTPP, coupled with the fact that we know the Biden administration is looking at creating a multilateral response that will align its Atlantic allies and Pacific allies and partners on the same page. I expect that there will be more of this consolidation and recognition that we need a multilateral, if not just a trilateral response to Chinese economic coercion.
Go ahead. Yes. Sorry, Boram. And I think another part of the question is about using the China angle to push Japan and Korea closer together, if anyone has a thought on that.
I just wanted to add on Sarah's point. Although the elephant in the room is China, our group sort of discussed that, well, it's not only China doing the economic coercion, it's middle powers too, like Japan and Korea. And then also sanctioned states who have a lot of grievances, they do things too. So it's not just China. We want to let you know that we're focused on, and building a platform to create norms to not do these kind of things is what we should aim for in the long term. Thanks.
Well said. Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in on China? If not, I have a bunch of other questions here from Scott Snyder. Thank you very much, Scott, for tuning in. We have a question about the CPTPP. I think it was Ayumi who was talking about the sequencing of entry into the CPTPP. And Scott would like to know if we think that CPTPP, and especially Japan, would be prepared to go with Korea first before the US and China as an entry partner. And maybe the UK announcement either makes this easier or harder, I'm not sure. And what do we think would be the impact on CPTPP of the PRC's possible counter response to the idea of Taiwan's entry into CPTPP? Of course, Taiwan has been mentioned as they're very anxious to join CPTPP. It hasn't gone beyond that yet, but is there anything that people could speculate about the China angle there? So I don't know who would like to talk about CPTPP, but Ayumi, maybe we'll go to you to start us off. And certainly the Korean, I mean, it'd be great to have a little bit of better feeling for how serious Korea is and how hard they're pushing and what the resistance is.
Right. I also welcome Korean perspectives as well. I would love to know how enthusiastic the public sentiment is towards CPTPP in Seoul. But from Japanese perspective, I think there has been only little discussions or reporting about Korea's interest into CPTPP, and it was really around the same time, or even after Xi Jinping actually expressed that he's also interested in CPP, and a month later, Moon Jae-in actually expressed. So it wasn't really clear whether Moon Jae-in was expressing it because Xi Jinping expressed it a month earlier or not. So there were a little bit of mixed signals about how much Korea was willing to join CPTPP independently, and it sees interest in joining this like-minded states on value making and norm making, and actually ensuring rules in Indo-Pacific trade and investment. But I do think, why not? I mean, I think one of the core fundamental reason why Japan and South Korea's mistrust deepened was because Japanese side saw this massive threat coming from China, and Korea didn't seem to be working alongside with Japan and other like-minded states, and Japan couldn't really understand that difference. Of course, there is the history of divided peninsula that Japanese have to take into account, but this disconnect of what Japanese are seeing as threat coming from mainland China, and then the lack of sort of enthusiasm in bringing of Korea into the Indo-Pacific strategy was actually the core root of mistrust, I do think. So if Japan could bring South Korea in along with working with Canada and Australia, I think that would be a positive step. I don't think that Japanese government will be against such idea. And along with Canada and Australia endorsing that step, I think Japan can take that step without little political cost. And on the question of the CPTPP and then Taiwan's involvement, of course, Beijing will be unhappy, but we have to kind of ensure there is a distinction between UN-based organizations that require one state and one country system, and all these economic frameworks that allows nations, not nation states, but nations to actually join economies to join these frameworks. So we just have to kind of clarify that there is core difference between UN-based organizations and these economic frameworks, and that we are not changing the framework of one country of China PRC recognition. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that the CPTPP was originally an APEC-based initiative, and Taiwan, of course, is a member of APEC. But I wonder if we could come to Kuyun also for a Korean perspective here. And the issue that Ayumi raised about the Indo-Pacific strategy is one that's come up in a couple of the questions that we've gotten, including one from Aaron Rabena. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but who asked about South Korea's new Southern policy and how it aligns with Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy. So there is a lot of interest in the notion of this Indo-Pacific strategy, new Southern policy, how the diversification strategies maybe of Japan and Korea, in order to be less dependent on the China market, can align together and work together, and what is the role maybe of CPTPP and that kind of a possibility. So I'd be very curious to get your thoughts, Kuyun.
Yeah, when it comes to New Southern policy and how it coincides or kind of overlapping and aligned with Japan's initiative, I think there are many domains and many kind of initiatives that can be aligned each other. And actually our report discussed the role of development assistance and humanitarian aid to these regions, especially toward the ASEAN regions, in which both countries can cooperate not only for the development assistance, but also kind of rulemaking in terms of digital kind of infrastructure. So I think it is not impossible, but I think it is better to find the kind of more details about cooperations and how it actually aligned with kind of new Indo-Pacific strategy of United States under the new Biden administration, I guess.
Great, thank you very much. I would like to bring a couple people in on another question that we've gotten here from Gibbon Kim from the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, Boram's home agency also, who is curious about whether or not there were discussions among our group about technology, and specifically whether or not there was any discussion of potential trilateral cooperation on trying to secure technology supply chains. In this whole discussion that we've now been having for a couple of years about the intersection of national security and these global supply chains in technology. Of course, Japan, Korea, and the US are all extremely interested in these developments, and whether or not there are any thoughts from anyone, or if anyone wants to talk about the discussions that were had among the working groups. And I'll turn to Seimei first for her thoughts. Thank you for raising your hand. Go ahead.
Thank you for the question. I recall that in one of the discussions, we talked about creating a tech alliance or a coalition between advanced democracies. And the discussion focused on how can we start making a regime building on how to promote tech cooperation with the goal of ensuring that the creators of the rules for cooperation are democratic countries. But I think after a long discussion of throwing back and forth ideas, we came to the conclusion that this would be like a very high level of alignment. And it depends on what type of technology we're talking about, the scope, and how it could be willingly shared without export control measures. So we didn't really come to a full conclusion on that, because the premise of that is that there is already a higher level of alignment between the three countries. But this was a very interesting point that I think all of us would like to think about deeper in the future.
Great, thank you. And Boram, go ahead. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. I think you're on mute.
I started by saying hi, Kibam. I remember David Dollar and us having this conversation about tech alliances, and I asked, is this something we can do? And I remember David saying, not really, because it's not inclusive enough. And then we tried to think about what areas that we could cooperate. We didn't talk specifically about 5G, but we did realize that when it comes to high tech, it's very sensitive, and that even allies don't really share. So we talk a lot about cyber cooperation, but when you really get to the nuts and bolts, it's hard because it's very sensitive. So I think that sort of gets the temperature of our discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem. Andrew, please go ahead.
Yeah, one of the few developments that I like to point out from the South Korean in South Korea is that the Moon administration is still rejecting the U.S. government's request to rip and replace the Huawei and Chinese technology in South Korea's LGU Plus's infrastructure. So LGU Plus currently employs Huawei technology about for 30% of their older version of 4G LTE, I think. And then they are planning to employ 100% of Huawei technology for their newer version of 5G, the real 5G, they say. They call it. And they will decide it within this year. South Korea just calls it that it's the corporate's business, not the US government and the South Korean government to decide upon. That said, I think there's a silver lining, because I think Kurt Campbell in his Foreign Affairs article that there's a need for the United States to present a practical benefit to the allies. And he says it's not the matter of just showing up. He argues that the United States need to show up again with practical benefits, and I think the United States can provide a benefit in a way in light of the upcoming SMA negotiation, right? South Korea has been harassed tremendously under the Trump administration over the SMA, the burden sharing over the defense cost and the base hosting, and there's a benefit that the U.S. can provide by providing a discount to the South Korea's share of the SMA negotiation for a limited period of time, which then South Korean government can reimburse or even provide to the South Korean company LGU Plus to rip and replace and use more benign technology like the Ericsson to you know, to mitigate the problems that were addressed by the legislative branch in the 2011 and 2021 NDAA. In one of the many provisions in the NDAA, there is a bipartisan push that the host nations of the U.S. forces around the globe should mitigate the threat that are posed to the U.S. forces and the U.S. assets by the Chinese technology, including Huawei and ZT. And that poses a lot of pressure as well, that both to Biden administration and South Korean government, because it is a call from the legislative colleagues within the US politics that should be addressed by the executive branch of the federal government. And if there's no reimbursement or practical or even financial support that Biden can provide while demanding South Korea to rip and replace Huawei, if it decides to continue the push for technology alliance against China, I think there is no difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration in just demanding for what's good only for the United States.
Great, thank you. I think it definitely bears mentioning, as the Brits have pointed out, that this kind of reap and replace program is very, very expensive. So I think you focusing on the resources is probably a good place to focus the attention. Okay, we have time maybe for one more question, but since nobody's asked it, I would like to try to sort of end on the question that usually starts off these kinds of presentations, which is about North Korea. North Korea has been mentioned very little actually during our hour-and-a-half panel discussion, which is not normal for a discussion about security issues in Northeast Asia, which shows you maybe the extent to which China has impinged on our consciousness, or maybe it shows the extent to which, since it's been a quiet period with North Korea, it's receded a little bit, but I'm sure it's not receded in the minds of some people, and it's likely to reemerge fairly soon at some point in the coming year, I would guess. And so I'd just like to give people a chance to talk a little bit about the sort of the trilateral grouping here in the context of a potential North Korean provocation. So and what kinds of additional pressures or what kinds of additional cooperation might that spur? And I know that everyone in the group has thoughts on this, but let me go just quickly to Masashi, and maybe then to Seimei, and then maybe to Sarah for some thoughts on a potential North Korea scenario and how you think, having a different administration in the US is going to potentially affect the kinds of cooperation that we'll be able to see among the allies, and what you think the Biden administration's focus would be in that case with Japan and Korea.
Thank you very much. So as we know that the spring has been the missile testing season in Korean Peninsula. So of course that the defense, the analysts and some other experts that has already been focused on what's North Korea do in this spring. And this is one of the the first test case of the new Biden administration. And how do we deal with that issues that they already revealed some new missile systems in that last year and early of this year's military parade. So in that sense that we needed to care about that issue. So of course that the approach from the Japanese perspective doesn't change a lot, but we expected some significant change from the Trump administration's top level or summit level approach. The President Biden has already mentioned that they doesn't do those kind of approach like President Trump or Trump administration. So I'm personally expected to restart or revitalize of the U.S. ROK, regular military exercise like a few years ago, or change a more deeper collaboration with the Trilateral Defense Cooperation meeting with how to deal with those kind of issues. So we needed to focus. Of course, that I understand that the importance of the diplomacy in this field, but at the same time, we needed to redefine of the role of the military capability of this region.
Great, thank you very much. Seimei, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you. I think the one big unknown is what the Biden administration's policy on North Korea will be, and we won't know this until we get a full review. But already, though, there are signs that a gap exists between Seoul and Washington on how to approach the North Korea problem. South Korean media drew a lot of attention to a White House statement recently that the US would adopt, quote, a new approach towards North Korea. So this has gotten a lot of press coverage in South Korea, because in contrast, President Moon expressed that the Biden administration should carry on from the Singapore agreement. So we already see that there's a little bit of a mismatch in expectations. So that's one area of concern. But from Korea's perspective, another looming challenge will be to promote inter-Korean relations in a way that doesn't come at the expense of positive relations with the US. The example is that North Korea said they're willing to have inter-Korean exchanges on the condition that military exercises are suspended. So I'm a little bit worried about how that's going to play out. And I think so this links to the recommendations in the reports about the importance of frequent dialogue, not just between the US and ROK, but also with Japan, not necessarily with the objective of coming to a trilateral convergence on policy towards North Korea, but more to secure an understanding of where the strategic differences lie between the three countries.
Great, thank you. And Sarah, I'm sorry I've only left you 30 seconds, but send us out with a bang, and not literally, please.
Yes, not literally, but I'll be quick. I think North Korea presents obviously one of the thorniest challenges for the Biden administration, not just because it's North Korea, but in terms of this trilateral relationship that we've been spending the last hour and a half talking about, because you see very clearly a Tokyo that is eager and will be lobbying Washington for a more activist seat at the table when Washington is developing over the course of the next 6 months its North Korean policy. And you see conversely in the Blue House in Seoul that they want to make sure that this remains a peninsula issue. So on the trilateral front as well, North Korea will present a challenge for the Biden administration.
Yeah, in addition to a lot of challenges that they face otherwise. So thank you for that. And we wish our colleagues in Washington, in the Blue House, and in Tokyo all the best as we go forward in the current conditions of pandemic and economic pressures. Let me thank all of you. I want to really thank our participants, our panelists today. The audience has been great and so many good questions. And also, of course, our mentors who's helped us put together what I think is a really terrific report. So back to you, Susan, are you there?
I'm still here, and I want to reiterate what Susan said. It's been a fascinating and very interesting discussion. Thanks to all of you, especially the participants who not only took today, but have taken the past few months to put together this really fantastic report. And I think it just underscores the importance of the relationship among our three countries. So thanks again, and I look forward to more discussions like this in the future. And thanks to all the participants. Bye-bye.